Security dragged a world-famous black doctor out of first class in front of the entire plane, humiliated, disrespected, and silenced. But what happened next? One phone call turned his humiliation into a national scandal that shook Washington, destroyed an airline, and changed history forever. This is the story the airline never wanted you to hear. Dr. Marcus Johnson adjusted his tie as he walked through the polished glass doors of Dulles International Airport. The fluorescent lights reflected off the spotless floor, and the faint smell of coffee and jet fuel lingered in the air. He had just wrapped up a grueling 3-day neurosurgery conference in Washington, D.C., where he had been the keynote speaker, a rare honor in his field, and rarer still for a black man who had clawed his way up through a world that hadn't always welcomed him. He wasn't just another doctor. He was the Dr. Marcus Johnson, one of the youngest neurosurgeons ever to head a department at Johns Hopkins Hospital. His breakthroughs in brain trauma surgery had earned him international recognition. Yet despite all the accolades, Marcus still carried himself with quiet humility. He wasn't one to flaunt his wealth or status. He still drove the same navy blue sedan he bought a decade ago. But today, after back-to-back lectures, panels, and dinners, he had given himself one indulgence: a first-class ticket home to Atlanta. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button to stand for justice, subscribe so you never miss another powerful story, and share this video with a friend who needs to see it. Together we make sure voices like Dr. Johnson's can never be dragged off and silenced again. As he approached the TSA checkpoint, he pulled his boarding pass and passport from the sleek leather case his daughter had gifted him last Father's Day. The agent barely glanced up, scanning his pass. "First class, huh?" the officer muttered under his breath, not quite loud enough for others to hear, but just sharp enough for Marcus to notice. Marcus gave the faintest smile and nodded. "Yes, sir. First class." He was used to it by now, the raised eyebrows, the disbelief in people's eyes when they realized he wasn't just another businessman or athlete, but a world-renowned surgeon. He had faced far worse growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Baltimore, where his mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. If she could endure years of hardship without breaking, Marcus could certainly handle the occasional skepticism of strangers. Still, each remark carried a sting he never quite got used to. After clearing security, Marcus headed to the first-class lounge. The leather chairs, free cappuccinos, and soft classical music were a stark contrast to the chaos outside the frosted glass doors. He settled into a corner seat and opened his laptop, reviewing patient notes for a complex surgery scheduled for the following week. He didn't notice the flight attendant at first. A slim woman in her mid-30s, blonde hair tucked neatly into a bun, glanced his way, then quickly looked again. She wore the crisp navy blue uniform of Atlantic Air, his carrier for tonight's flight. Her gaze lingered just a little too long. Marcus gave her a polite nod. "Good evening," she hesitated before nodding back. Then, with a tight smile, she walked away. When the loudspeaker finally announced, "Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight 478 to Atlanta," Marcus gathered his things and headed to the gate. As he scanned his pass, the gate agent gave him a long, scrutinizing look. Her professional smile never wavered, but her eyes betrayed the flicker of doubt. Marcus had seen it before, the silent question. Does he really belong here? "Yes, that's me," Marcus said lightly, sliding the boarding pass across the scanner. The machine beeped approvingly. He picked up his briefcase and walked down the jet bridge. The first-class cabin was half empty, its plush leather seats arranged in neat rows. He stowed his bag overhead and sat down by the window. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to exhale. The quiet hum of the engines was oddly comforting, but peace was short-lived. Minutes later, another passenger entered the cabin, a man in a gray business suit with a Rolex flashing on his wrist. He glanced at Marcus, hesitated, and then stuffed his carry-on into the overhead compartment a few rows ahead. Marcus noticed the subtle shake of his head as if the man was silently registering his disapproval. Another couple entered, a woman with a diamond necklace and her husband in a tailored navy blazer. The woman stopped, blinked at Marcus, and whispered something to her husband. They both glanced his way before moving past. Marcus stared out the window, determined to ignore it. But the murmurs, the looks, the weight of unspoken assumptions, they piled on like invisible stones. The same blonde flight attendant from the lounge reappeared in the aisle, moving from passenger to passenger, offering assistance. When she reached Marcus, her tone shifted ever so slightly, adopting a clipped, formal cadence. "Sir, are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, holding out her hand as if ready to take his boarding pass. Marcus looked up, calm but firm. "Yes, seat 3A, first class," her lips pursed. "I see. May I check your boarding pass again just to confirm?" Marcus retrieved it from his pocket and handed it to her. She studied it longer than necessary, her eyes flicking back and forth as though she was searching for a mistake. Finally, she handed it back. "Very well," she said, her voice taut with something unsaid. "Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened. We'll be departing shortly." As she walked away, Marcus caught the disapproving glance she exchanged with the other attendant across the aisle. Before takeoff, Marcus pulled out his phone to check in with his daughter, Naomi. She had just started her first year at Harvard Law School, and though she insisted she was fine, Marcus could hear the stress in her voice during their last conversation. "Dad, you made it to your flight?" Naomi's voice crackled through the phone. "Yes, sweetheart. I'll be home in a couple of hours," Marcus said, softening at the sound of her. "Good. You sound tired." "I am, but I'll rest once I'm home." "How's school?" she groaned. "Exams are brutal, but I'll manage." "That's my girl," Marcus said with a smile. "Remember what I always told you, pressure makes diamonds." They said their goodbyes just as the flight crew announced all phones should be switched to airplane mode. Marcus powered his down and slipped it into his pocket. Little did he know, before this flight landed, that same phone would be the key to toppling an entire airline. The plane rumbled down the runway, engines roaring, cabin vibrating with the raw power of flight. As the nose lifted into the sky, Marcus closed his eyes, trying to block out the fatigue, the stares, the weight of being constantly judged. He told himself it would be fine. Just 2 hours, just a flight home, but he could feel it in the air. The tension wasn't going away, somewhere deep in his gut. Marcus sensed that this flight was going to be very different. This was only the beginning. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. A quiet settled over the first-class cabin, broken only by the occasional clink of glasses and the low murmur of passengers placing drink orders. Dr. Marcus Johnson leaned back against the leather headrest, pulling a medical journal from his briefcase. Reading research papers had always been a way to ground himself, like a reminder that beyond the politics, the prejudice, and the noise, his work actually saved lives. He had just turned to an article on traumatic brain injuries when the blonde flight attendant appeared at his row again. Her smile was thin, professional, but her eyes carried something sharper. "Sir," she said, tilting her head, "may I see your ticket one more time?" Marcus lowered his journal. "You already checked it before takeoff." "Yes," she said quickly, "but we're just making sure all our passengers are properly seated. Sometimes there are mistakes." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mistakes, as though the mistake couldn't possibly be hers but his. Marcus met her gaze, calm but steady. "I can assure you there's no mistake. I purchased this ticket weeks ago. Seat 3A. She hesitated, then gave a curt nod and moved on. But Marcus could feel the eyes of nearby passengers drilling into him. Whispers floated from the row behind him, low, but not low enough. "Unbelievable," a woman's voice muttered. "Probably upgraded himself somehow," a man replied. "Or using someone else's ticket." Marcus inhaled slowly through his nose, forcing himself to keep his composure. This wasn't new. Not the suspicion. Not the doubt. But sitting in a seat he had every right to, surrounded by strangers who thought otherwise, it carved at his dignity in a way that never grew easier. Half an hour into the flight, the attendant returned with a tray. "Would you like something to drink, sir? Wine? Champagne?" "Just water, please," Marcus replied. She poured it, her movements stiff. Then, after placing the glass on his tray table, she lingered. "Sir, I'll ask you once more. Do you have the proper identification for this ticket? This seat costs thousands of dollars and—" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Are you asking every passenger for identification or just me?" The attendant blinked, caught off guard. Her professional mask slipped for half a second. "I'm just following procedure." "I see," Marcus said evenly. "Then I'll assume you're asking the gentleman in 2C for his ID as well?" He gestured toward the man in the business suit, who was now pretending to be very interested in his laptop. The attendant's jaw tightened. She didn't reply. Instead, she gave a forced smile, gathered her tray, and walked away. Marcus sipped his water slowly, forcing his hand not to shake. It wasn't anger that burned in his chest. It was something colder, heavier. Humiliation. An hour into the flight, turbulence rocked the cabin. Seatbelt signs flickered back on, and passengers shifted nervously. The attendants hurried up and down the aisles, securing trays and instructing everyone to stay seated. When the turbulence subsided, Marcus stood to stretch his legs. Long surgeries had trained his body to handle exhaustion, but airplane seats, first class or not, were never kind to his back. He walked a few steps down the aisle before turning back toward his seat. That's when it happened. The blonde attendant blocked his way, arms crossed. "Sir, you need to return to your assigned seat. Coach is that way." She gestured behind her with her chin. The cabin went silent. Every head turned toward them. Marcus froze. "Excuse me?" "I said coach is that way," she repeated, her voice louder now, as if deliberately putting on a show. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers looked uncomfortable. Others smirked, as though they were watching a spectacle unfold. Marcus's voice was calm, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "I am in first class. My seat is 3A. I have been there since boarding." The attendant's smile hardened into something sharper. "Then perhaps you should show me proof again. Because I find it hard to believe—" "Hard to believe what?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but low. The pause was telling. The weight of her silence said more than words ever could. The attendant's cheeks flushed. She turned abruptly and strode toward the front of the cabin. Moments later, she returned with the head purser, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a clipped tone. "Sir," the purser began, "we've had some concerns raised about your seating. May I see your boarding pass once again?" Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and produced it without a word. The purser examined it, his eyes flicking from the ticket to Marcus, then back again. "It appears valid," he said finally. But instead of handing it back immediately, he added, "However, we've had complaints about your behavior. You're making other passengers uncomfortable." Marcus's jaw tightened. "By sitting in my seat? By—" "Causing disruptions," the purser replied vaguely. "Sir, if this continues, I'll have no choice but to involve security when we land in Charlotte." The words hit like a blow. Involve security, as though he were some criminal. As though sitting in first class, reading a journal, and asking to be treated fairly was a disruption. Marcus took his ticket back, slid it into his pocket, and sat down without another word. But inside, a storm was brewing. The murmurs returned, louder this time. Unbelievable. Should have stayed in coach. People always trying to take advantage, but not everyone agreed. A young woman across the aisle, perhaps in her 20s, leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I saw his ticket. He's in the right seat. He hasn't done anything wrong." The purser gave her a polite but dismissive nod. "Ma'am, please stay out of this. We'll handle it." "No," she said, louder now. "You're not handling it. You're harassing him." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably as if realizing the truth but unwilling to get involved. Others shook their heads, muttering under their breath. Marcus said nothing. He simply folded his hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the window, watching the endless dark sky outside. As the flight continued, Marcus felt the weight of every stare. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain still, composed. Losing his temper would only feed their narrative. Instead, he reminded himself who he was, a doctor, a man who had held lives in his hands, a man who had earned every bit of respect these people were denying him, And as he sat there, humiliated yet unbroken, a quiet thought took root. They don't know who they're dealing with. Not yet. What the airline didn't realize was that Marcus wasn't just a passenger with a first-class ticket. He was a man with connections, powerful connections. And if they pushed him too far, he had the means to shake their entire foundation. But for now, he stayed silent, waiting, watching. The storm wasn't over. It was only gathering strength. The soft hum of the engines was the only thing that kept Dr. Marcus Johnson anchored as he sat silently in seat 3A, staring at the storm of clouds outside the window. His reflection looked back at him in the glass. Calm, collected, but his jaw tight, his eyes carrying the weight of quiet fury. The flight attendants hadn't returned to his row for nearly an hour. But Marcus could feel their presence, the sideways glances, the muffled whispers with the purser. The tension in the cabin was thick, pressing against him like an invisible wall. When the captain's voice finally broke through the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making a brief stop in Charlotte before continuing on to Atlanta. Please remain seated as we prepare for descent." Marcus's stomach sank. Charlotte. That was where the purser had threatened to bring in security. Marcus tightened his grip on the armrest. He had hoped, foolishly, that the threat was just that. Words meant to intimidate, to remind him of his place. But as the seatbelt sign flickered back on and the plane tilted downward, he realized the situation was far from over. The landing was smooth, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was anything but. Marcus could sense it. The anticipation, the unspoken expectation that something was about to happen. The whispers grew louder. Finally, they'll deal with him. Should have known this was coming. Some people just don't learn. Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him, refusing to feed their hunger for a reaction. The plane taxied to the gate, and within moments, the door opened. The usual cheerfulness of the flight attendants, "Thank you for flying with us," was absent. Instead, the purser's face was stiff, his voice clipped as he spoke into his walkie-talkie, and then Marcus saw them. 2 airport security officers boarded the plane, their neon vests a jarring contrast to the polished calm of the first-class cabin. Their boots echoed against the carpet as they made their way down the aisle, faces stern, eyes scanning until they landed on him. "Sir," one of them said firmly, "we need you to come with us." Every head turned. The entire first-class cabin and even curious faces peering from economy watched as the officers stopped beside Marcus's seat. Marcus looked up slowly, his voice steady. "Is there a reason you're asking me to leave my seat?" "Sir, we've received reports of disruptive behavior," the officer said, repeating the airline's rehearsed script. "You'll need to disembark for questioning." Marcus blinked, incredulous. "Disruptive behavior? Sitting in my assigned seat is now considered disruptive?" The blonde flight attendant appeared behind the officers, her arms folded, her chin tilted upward with a self-satisfied air. "He's been argumentative, refused to comply with simple instructions, and has made passengers uncomfortable," she declared. Marcus turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "You mean I refuse to accept your harassment?" "There's a difference." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Some passengers leaned forward eagerly, drinking in the drama like spectators at an arena. Others shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by what they were witnessing. The officer's tone hardened. "Sir, stand up now, or we'll be forced to remove you." Marcus's instincts screamed at him to resist, to plant his feet firmly and demand the dignity he deserved. But another part of him, the part that had seen what happened to men who resisted, knew better. Still, he wasn't going to go quietly. He rose slowly, deliberately, his 6-foot frame towering over the officers. His voice carried across the cabin, calm but sharp as steel. "I want everyone here to remember what you're witnessing. I have done nothing wrong. My only crime is sitting in a seat I paid for." Phones came out instantly. Screens glowed as passengers began recording. Marcus saw it in his peripheral vision. The shaky hands, the whispered commentary, the hunger for viral content. The officers grabbed his arms, their grip firm but not yet brutal. "Sir, let's go." As they began leading him down the aisle, Marcus kept his head high. But the humiliation seared him like fire. The murmurs followed him, sharp knives of judgment. Should have known. Troublemaker. Probably didn't even pay for the ticket. And then, clear as a bell, came a different voice. The young woman who had defended him earlier. "This is wrong. He hasn't done anything," she shouted, her phone held high, recording every second. "You're targeting him because he's black." The cabin buzzed with tension. Some passengers hissed at her to be quiet. Others muttered their agreement. But the officers ignored her, their focus fixed solely on Marcus. The jet bridge was cold, the fluorescent lights harsh. The officers guided Marcus into a waiting area near the gate, where another uniformed man was already waiting. An airline representative, clipboard in hand, his face impassive. "Dr. Johnson," the man said, his tone falsely polite. "We regret the disruption, but due to your behavior, you'll not be continuing on this flight." Marcus stared at him, his voice dangerously quiet. "Behavior? You mean your staff's prejudice?" "Sir, we've received multiple complaints," the representative replied flatly. "This decision is final." Marcus exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. Losing his temper here would only play into their narrative. But inside something hardened. They thought they had stripped him of his dignity. They thought dragging him off that plane would reduce him to nothing more than a problem erased. But they had no idea who he really was. Behind him, passengers streamed out of the plane, their voices a mixture of curiosity and outrage. Some shook their heads, muttering about the disruption. Others whispered in sympathy, their eyes downcast as if afraid to be too vocal. The young woman approached Marcus cautiously, her phone still recording. "I saw everything," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm going to post this. People need to know what they did to you." Marcus gave her a faint, tired smile. "Thank you. The truth has a way of finding its voice." Her hands shook as she uploaded the video right there at the gate, her determination shining through her nervousness. As security escorted him toward a holding area, Marcus finally pulled out his phone. His hands were steady now. His mind, sharp as ever, was already calculating. He scrolled through his contacts until he reached a name few people would recognize, but everyone in Washington respected. A powerful senator, an old friend from his college days, someone who owed Marcus more than one favor. Marcus's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before pressing call. The line rang once, twice, and then, "Marcus, it's late. Everything all right?" Marcus's voice was calm, but beneath it was a steel edge that hadn't been there before. "No, everything is not all right. I've just been dragged off a plane, and I think it's time we had a conversation about Atlantic Air." The storm had broken, and the airline had no idea what was coming. The holding room was quiet, sterile, and suffocating. A few plastic chairs lined the wall, and a fluorescent light above flickered with a faint buzz. Dr. Marcus Johnson sat with his hands folded in his lap, his briefcase at his feet, his mind replaying every second of humiliation he had just endured. The sting of being dragged from that plane still burned in his chest, but it was not the sting of defeat. It was the sting of resolve. He pulled out his phone again, scrolled to the contact that mattered most, and pressed call. It rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "Marcus, you all right?" Marcus closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the familiarity of the voice ground him. Senator David Whitaker, senior senator from Georgia, chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and more importantly, Marcus's closest friend from college. "No, David," Marcus said evenly. "I am not all right. I've just been dragged off a first-class flight. No explanation except that a flight attendant and purser decided I didn't belong there." The silence on the other end stretched heavy. When the senator finally spoke, his tone was ice. "Which airline?" "Atlantic Air." "Jesus Christ." Whitaker exhaled sharply. "They don't know who they just messed with." Marcus's voice stayed calm, almost too calm. "That's the problem. They don't care who they mess with. I'm just another black man they thought they could humiliate and erase. But I won't be erased, David. Not this time. The senator's chair creaked through the phone as if he had leaned forward. "Give me the details, everything. I'll have staff draft an official inquiry within the hour. FAA, DOT, Civil Rights Division, hell, I'll get the White House if I have to." Marcus gave him a careful account, every detail precise, measured, just as he would dictate medical notes after a surgery. The boarding pass checked 3 times. The whispers, the accusations, the purser's threat, and finally the public humiliation of being dragged off the plane in front of dozens of witnesses. When he finished, Whitaker's voice carried a quiet fury. "I'll make the call tonight. You'll have a hearing before the week is out." Marcus ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. For the first time since boarding that plane, he allowed himself a deep breath. Not relief. Not yet. But a calm certainty. He had fought too hard, sacrificed too much to let them reduce him to nothing. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "When they push you down, Marcus, you stand taller. That's how you win." Across the room, one of the security officers leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His expression had softened since they'd left the gate, but suspicion lingered in his eyes. "You're free to go, Dr. Johnson," the officer finally said, his tone less aggressive than before. "The airline's decision stands, but you're not being charged." Marcus stood slowly, picking up his briefcase. "Of course I'm not being charged." "Because I did nothing wrong." The officer looked away, as if ashamed to meet his gaze. As Marcus left the holding area, he noticed a small cluster of people at the terminal. The young woman from the plane, the one who had defended him, was among them, phone still in hand. She rushed up to him. "Dr. Johnson!" "It's already online. The video, it's spreading like wildfire. Thousands of views in less than an hour." Marcus blinked, momentarily stunned. "That fast?" "Yes," she said breathlessly. "People are furious. Hashtags are trending already. Justice for Dr. Johnson. Atlantic Air scandal." Behind her, 2 young men nodded in agreement. One of them spoke up. "It's not just social media. Local news outlets are already reaching out for statements." "This is going to blow up, sir." Marcus gave a weary smile. "Good. Let the truth speak for itself." But even as he said it, he knew truth alone wasn't always enough. That's why he had made the call. The videos would ignite public outrage, but Washington, that would deliver the hammer. That same evening, Senator Whitaker sat in his office, the lights of Capitol Hill glowing outside his window. He held his phone to his ear as he spoke to the Secretary of Transportation. "I don't care if it's midnight," he snapped. "I want the FAA to open a civil rights investigation into Atlantic Air immediately. They forcibly removed a passenger from first class with no justification except prejudice, and that passenger happens to be one of the top neurosurgeons in the country." A pause, then Whitaker's voice hardened. "No, I don't care about PR fallout. This isn't just about one man. This is systemic. You'll have my committee breathing down your neck if this isn't addressed by morning." He ended the call and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his thinning hair. His thoughts returned to college. 2 young men, one white, one black, studying late into the night, dreaming of changing the world. Marcus had done it through medicine, Whitaker through politics, and now fate had aligned to demand they wield their power together. Back at Atlantic Air headquarters, the night shift was in chaos. A vice president of corporate communications slammed his laptop shut, sweat beating at his temples. "This video has 5 million views already," he barked to his team. 5 million? Do you realize what that means? "We're trending worldwide for all the wrong reasons," a junior PR manager stammered. "Should we issue a statement?" "Yes, but not some bland apology," the VP snapped. "This isn't going away. And if Washington is getting involved..." He stopped himself, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. The airline had weathered storms before. Delays, cancellations, even lawsuits. But this was different. This wasn't about logistics. This was about morality, justice, and the very soul of the company. And deep down, they knew. They had picked the wrong man to humiliate. Later that night, Marcus sat in a quiet hotel room near the airport. He hadn't made it home to Atlanta, not yet. His flight had been stolen from him, but his dignity was still intact. He removed his tie, draped it over the chair, and sat at the desk, staring at the glow of his phone. Notifications poured in. Messages of support from strangers, calls from reporters, even sympathetic notes from fellow doctors across the country. But beneath the noise, Marcus's thoughts were clear. This wasn't about him alone. It was about every black traveler who had been told they didn't belong. Every professional whose qualifications were doubted. Every voice silenced in the name of procedure. For too long, prejudice had been allowed to hide behind politeness. But tonight the mask had slipped, and now the world would see it for what it truly was. As Marcus finally lay down to rest, his phone buzzed once more. A text from Senator Whitaker. It's done. FAA and Civil Rights Division both on it. Prepare yourself. This is going to be bigger than either of us imagined. Marcus set the phone aside and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easily, but his heart was steady. He had been dragged from a plane, humiliated in front of strangers. But with a single phone call, the tables had turned. The storm was no longer gathering. It had already begun. The sun had barely risen when the storm arrived. By 6 a.m., Hog Justice for Dar Johnson was the #1 trending hashtag worldwide. Millions of tweets, reposts, and shares filled every corner of the internet. The shaky cell phone footage of Marcus being dragged from the plane had been uploaded in dozens of angles, stitched into montages, slowed down, narrated, and dissected frame by frame everywhere. The same question thundered, how could this happen? On CNN, a stern-faced anchor replayed the clip as the headline blared, Atlantic Air under fire after doctors forced removal. Viewers, what you are watching is sparking outrage across the nation, the anchor said gravely. Dr. Marcus Johnson, one of America's leading neurosurgeons, was forcibly removed from first class by Atlantic Air flight crew last night. Witnesses claim he was targeted because of his race. On another channel, a panel of legal experts debated federal aviation law. One attorney slammed his fist against the table. This is not just a PR issue, this is a civil rights violation. The Department of Justice must get involved. By noon, Marcus's face was everywhere. On every headline, every homepage, every TV screen in airports, cafes, and offices. In Atlanta, Marcus's hometown, protesters began gathering outside Atlantic Air's regional office. By evening, the crowd had swelled to thousands, carrying signs that read, "We belong here," "Justice for Dr. Johnson," "No seat for racism." The chants echoed through downtown, "Dragged off a plane, never again." News helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting live images of the swelling sea of voices, and it wasn't just Atlanta. In New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, even London, solidarity marches began forming. Social media had sparked something larger than outrage. It had ignited a movement. Marcus stayed quiet that day, tucked away in his hotel room, declining interviews. His phone buzzed constantly, offers from morning shows, requests from journalists, calls from colleagues and strangers alike. He answered only one, Senator Whitaker. "They're panicking," the senator said bluntly. "Atlantic Air's stock dropped 8% today. Their CEO is calling every lobbyist he knows to calm the fire." Marcus rubbed his temples. "David, I never asked for this. I know. But it's here. And maybe this is what we needed. Not just for you, for everyone who's been told to sit down and stay quiet." Marcus's voice was low but steady. "Then we won't stay quiet." In a sleek boardroom high above downtown Chicago, Atlantic Air's executives sat in grim silence. Screens on the walls showed live news coverage, angry hashtags, and footage of growing protests. The CEO, Richard Kellerman, a silver-haired man with the calm demeanor of a seasoned executive, finally spoke. "We issue an apology. Immediate, full, no half measures." The VP of Operations shook his head. "It won't be enough. People are calling for boycotts. The unions are nervous. Our flight crews are already getting harassed at airports." "Then what do you suggest?" Kellerman snapped. The room fell silent, because the truth was, no one knew how to stop a storm that had already swallowed the world. By 8 p.m., Atlantic Air released a carefully crafted statement. "We deeply regret the incident involving Dr. Marcus Johnson. We are conducting a full investigation, and we are committed to ensuring this never happens again. We apologize to Dr. Johnson and to all of our passengers. But within minutes, the internet tore it apart. Too late. Not enough. Regret is not justice. Screenshots of the statement were posted side by side with the video of Marcus being dragged from the plane. The contrast was damning. One viral tweet summed it up. "You can't apologize away humiliation." We saw it happen. We won't forget. The next morning, Marcus finally broke his silence. Standing at a podium in a small Atlanta church surrounded by supporters and flashing cameras, he delivered his first public statement. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. His voice was calm, steady, like the surgeon he was. "I was not dragged from that plane because I posed a threat. I was dragged because someone decided I didn't belong in first class. That decision was not about policy, it was about prejudice. But this is bigger than me. Every person who has ever been judged, doubted, or dismissed because of the color of their skin knows this pain. I am here to say, we will not be silent. Not anymore." The church erupted in applause, the sound echoing far beyond those walls. Clips of the speech spread online within hours. Commentators compared it to civil rights addresses of decades past. Hashtags surged again. "We will not be silent." "Justice for Dr. Johnson." "No seat for racism." 2 days later, the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation announced an emergency hearing. The subject line was simple but devastating. Hearing on passenger rights and airline discrimination. Senator Whitaker opened the session with fire in his voice. "This is not an isolated incident. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a systemic issue of racial discrimination in our airlines, and it ends now." Executives from Atlantic Air sat stiffly under the glare of cameras, their carefully rehearsed statements trembling in their hands. Behind them, Marcus sat quietly, dignified, his presence alone a reminder of the storm they had unleashed. For the first time in history, millions tuned in live to a Senate hearing about airlines. Hashtags exploded again. Late-night hosts opened with monologues about Atlantic Air. Celebrities tweeted their support. Churches, universities, and medical associations issued public statements. Marcus had become a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resistance. He was not just a passenger denied his seat. He was a man who refused to be erased. By the end of the week, Atlantic Air's market value had dropped by billions. Several board members resigned under pressure. Whispers spread that the CEO himself might step down, but for Marcus, none of that mattered. What mattered were the messages that poured in by the thousands. A mother in Detroit writing, "My son saw your speech. He asked me if he can be a doctor like you one day." A young woman in London tweeting, "I was kicked out of a store for looking suspicious. I cried watching your video. Thank you for standing tall for all of us." And from a fellow surgeon in Johannesburg, "Brother, you carried all of us onto that plane. And you carried us off with dignity." By the end of the week, it was no longer just about Atlantic Air. It was about accountability, equity, and respect in every corner of society. Protests grew. Boycotts expanded. Laws were drafted. And everywhere Marcus went, strangers greeted him not with pity, but with gratitude. For the first time, he realized something powerful. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's. The Senate hearing chamber was packed. Every seat was taken. Reporters, activists, airline lobbyists, curious citizens. Cameras lined the walls, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. The atmosphere was electric, thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was a reckoning. At the center sat two men. Dr. Marcus Johnson, calm, dignified, his hands folded neatly on the table before him. And across from him, Richard Kellerman, CEO of Atlantic Air, silver hair, immaculate suit, eyes cold behind rimless glasses. He looked every bit the unflappable executive. But the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed the pressure he was under. Senator Whitaker cleared his throat into the microphone. "This hearing will come to order," his voice boomed across the chamber. We are here to address a matter that has outraged the American public and tarnished our nation's trust in its airlines. Dr. Johnson? Mr. Kellerman, thank you for being here. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Every eye flicked to Marcus. Every lens zoomed in. Whitaker gestured to Marcus. Dr. Johnson, would you please describe in your own words what happened to you aboard Flight 478? Marcus adjusted the microphone. His voice was steady, measured, but carried an edge of restrained fire. I boarded the plane with a first-class ticket, purchased lawfully. I sat in my assigned seat. Shortly after, I was approached by a flight attendant who questioned whether I belonged there. Moments later, security dragged me from my seat, humiliating me in front of every passenger. I was treated not as a customer, not as a citizen, not as a man, but as a threat, for no reason other than the color of my skin. The chamber was silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. Marcus paused, then added, "And I will not accept an apology crafted by lawyers in a boardroom as justice." Applause erupted from the gallery, forcing Whitaker to pound the gavel. "Order, order!" Kellerman's eyes flicked toward Marcus, the slightest flare of irritation breaking through his polished exterior. Whitaker turned to Kellerman. "Mr. Kellerman, you've heard Dr. Johnson's account. How does Atlantic Air respond?" Kellerman leaned toward the mic, voice smooth and rehearsed. "First, let me express again our deepest regret to Dr. Johnson. Atlantic Air prides itself on diversity and inclusion. We transport over 70 million passengers annually, and incidents like this are extraordinarily rare. We are conducting an internal review and retraining staff to ensure this never occurs again." He offered a tight corporate smile, as if that closed the matter, but Marcus's gaze didn't waver. Senator Maria Delgado, fiery and sharp, cut in. "Mr. Kellerman, let's be clear. Are you suggesting Dr. Johnson's removal was a random mishap? Because the footage tells another story. Flight attendants insisted he leave after verifying his ticket. That doesn't look like a rare mishap. That looks like discrimination." Kellerman's smile faltered. "Senator, without the full context..." Delgado slammed her folder shut. "The context is clear. A black man in first class was assumed not to belong. That's not a policy problem. That's a culture problem in your airline." The crowd murmured in agreement. Kellerman shifted uncomfortably. "We cannot control every perception of every employee." Marcus finally spoke, his voice slicing through the tension. "You can control accountability." The room erupted again. Applause, cheers, murmurs of approval. The gavel banged furiously. Whitaker leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Kellerman, let me ask you directly. If Dr. Johnson had been white, do you believe this would have happened?" Kellerman froze. For the first time, his corporate armor cracked. He shifted in his chair, lips parting but no sound coming. The silence was deafening. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the sweat glistening on his forehead. Finally, he muttered, I cannot speculate." The chamber erupted in boos. Marcus, however, remained still, his face calm but his eyes burning with a quiet force. When the gavel restored order, Marcus leaned into his microphone. His voice carried the weight of not just his story, but of thousands who had lived silent versions of it. "This isn't just about me. This is about every passenger who has been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. About every black man stopped at an airport for a random search. Every woman told to calm down when she asks for her rights. Every child who watches and learns what this country thinks they deserve. I am here today not to take down an airline, but to demand change. Because dignity is not a luxury. Respect is not first class. It is a right." Thunderous applause filled the room, echoing into history. Whitaker seized the moment. "Then here is what this committee will do. We will be drafting new legislation on passenger rights and anti-discrimination protocols. Atlantic Air will answer for its failures, and the American people will see justice done." Cameras flashed wildly. Reporters scribbled. Protesters outside the building roared as news broke live. Kellerman slumped slightly in his chair, the weight of defeat sinking in. And Marcus? He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat with the quiet dignity that had carried him through the storm. Because this moment was never about revenge. It was about truth. When Marcus exited the hearing, the steps of the Capitol were overflowing, supporters waving signs, chanting his name, cheering not just for him, but for what he represented. A young boy pressed forward through the crowd, holding his mother's hand. His eyes were wide, filled with awe. "Are you really Dr. Johnson?" he asked shyly. Marcus crouched down to meet his gaze. "Yes, son, I am," the boy grinned. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. He placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Don't be like me, be better." "Be everything they told you you couldn't," the boy nodded, his mother wiping tears from her eyes. And as Marcus stood, facing the sea of supporters, cameras, and chants of justice, he realized something powerful. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The world had seen. The world had heard, and there was no going back. 3 months later, the world looked different. Atlantic Air, once untouchable, was on its knees. Stock prices had plummeted nearly 40%. Several executives had resigned under pressure, and Richard Kellerman himself stepped down in disgrace. The company's once pristine reputation was in ruins, its logo now synonymous with humiliation and injustice. But from those ashes, something unexpected began to rise. In Washington, Senator Whitaker and his colleagues pushed through what would soon be called the Passenger Bill of Rights. For the first time in U.S. history, airlines were legally bound to strict anti-discrimination protocols, transparency in seating and removals, and mandatory training for every crew member. Fines for violations were severe. Repeat offenders risked losing their licenses. On the Senate floor, Whitaker had invoked Marcus's name directly. Dr. Johnson endured humiliation so that millions would never have to. This law is not just about airlines, it's about dignity. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, but it didn't stop at airplanes. Marcus's story had lit a fire that spread into boardrooms, classrooms, hospitals, and corporations worldwide. Schools held assemblies about bias and belonging. Companies re-examined their hiring and training practices. Civil rights organizations reported a surge in young volunteers. On college campuses, student groups called their rallies the Johnson Movement, a campaign to demand fairness, visibility, and accountability wherever prejudice tried to hide. Marcus himself often stood on those stages, not as a victim, but as a voice. His speeches echoed across auditoriums. "We cannot choose the eyes that look at us, but we can choose to open our own and refuse to look away from injustice." Despite the whirlwind of attention, Marcus remained at his core the same man, a surgeon, a father, a quiet soul who still preferred evenings with medical journals over television cameras. Yet he was undeniably changed. Where once he walked into airports bracing for stares, now he was greeted with handshakes, gratitude, and respect. Flight crews whispered his name with admiration. Strangers approached him not with suspicion but with recognition. That's Dr. Johnson, the man who stood tall. Still, fame was never his goal. What mattered most were the lives he touched directly. One evening in Cambridge, Marcus visited Naomi at Harvard. She met him on the steps of her dorm, her eyes shining. "Dad," she said softly, "do you know how many of my classmates tell me they applied here because of you? Because they saw what you did?" Marcus smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. "And do you know how many times I've thought about giving up, Naomi? About staying silent? But I kept going because I wanted you to see that when the world tells you no, you answer with yes, always." She threw her arms around him, whispering, "I'm proud of you." For Marcus, no headline, no law, no applause could compare to those words. In an ironic twist, Atlantic Air itself began to change. Under new leadership, the company launched sweeping reforms, free legal support for any passenger mistreated on flights, transparency reports published quarterly, scholarships for underrepresented youth pursuing careers in aviation. It was an attempt at redemption, and slowly the public began to soften. But every reform traced back to one night, one man, one moment when truth refused to be silenced. Months later, Marcus returned to the small Atlanta church where he had given his first speech after the incident. This time there were no cameras, no reporters, just a modest gathering of neighbors and friends. He stood at the same podium, looking out at familiar faces. "Many have called what happened to me a tragedy," he began, "but I don't see it that way. It was painful, yes. Humiliating, yes. But tragedy is when injustice is suffered in silence. What we did together, what all of you did when you raised your voices, that was triumph. We proved that the truth cannot be dragged off a plane. It cannot be silenced. It cannot be grounded. The truth will always rise." The crowd rose with him, applause shaking the rafters. 6 months after the incident, Marcus boarded another Atlantic Air flight. For a moment, as he stepped into first class, memories tugged at him. The stares, the doubt, the hand gripping his arm, but this time, it was different. The flight attendant who greeted him was a young black woman, her smile genuine. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Johnson. We're honored to have you with us today." Passengers nearby didn't look at him with suspicion. They looked at him with respect. Some even nodded, as if silently saying, "Thank you." Marcus settled into his seat by the window. As the engines roared to life, he exhaled deeply. Not because he finally felt he belonged, but because he had proven, once and for all, that he always did. Years later, textbooks would tell the story. Documentaries would replay the footage. Students would write essays about the doctor who refused to be erased. But Marcus didn't need history books to know the truth. He saw it in the laws rewritten. He saw it in the protests turned into policies. He saw it in the faces of children who now dreamed without fear. And most of all, he saw it in his daughter, standing taller, speaking louder, daring to believe in a world that might one day match her father's courage. As the plane lifted into the sky, Marcus looked out the window, the clouds parting beneath him. For the first time since that fateful night, he didn't think of the humiliation. He thought of victory, because the world had tried to drag him down, and instead, he rose.